the sharecropping, which is a very different system. It's just a system basically of renting. And you have to put something in. If you're a black sharecropper, you're saying to the owner of the land, look, I've got something to put in. I've got 5 kids. I can put their labor in. I can find a way to feed myself. My wife can grow some food or whatever. So it's a more of a relationship where you have more say-so. But in 1865, it's really kind of up in the air. People are trying to make deals, and in the midst of trying to make those deals, you get, as Darryl referred to earlier, these codes where Mississippi says, well, black people, you can't own any land outside of an incorporated area. Well, what the crap? That means that you can't own farmland, right? So we're not gonna let you be farmers, even if you want to, but at the same time, you have people who do find ways to grab hold of a few acres. You know, in the South Carolina Low Country, you know, my part of the world, I was born and raised in South Carolina, people are fighting to hold on to the Sherman lands. They're fighting to hold on to lands that they claimed, that they bought from the Treasury Department. So it's a very dynamic situation. And in some places, people do buy land. And so in the 20th century, we have a number of black landowners. And when you think about the recent suits against the Agricultural Department by black farmers, those suits have a history, right? Going back to the post-war era. So in terms of working, and black people did not have much choice. Black women, for the most part, were accused of wanting to become like white women and going into the house and not working at all, when in fact they were working in the fields and working in white homes at the same time. But they had decided that if they worked for white women, they would no longer do so in white homes if they could help it. So they would go and say, look, you know, you want me to do your laundry? Give it to me. I'll take it to my house and wash it. I'll come and clean your house from this hour to that hour, but I won't stay overnight. So these are the kinds of sort of ordinary Martha. Where's Martha? Martha referred earlier this morning to thinking about the importance of looking at ordinary people and ordinary lives. And when we do that and we get beyond the high politics, which are crucially important to how people will live their lives, but we also have to get down and look at how they actually do live their lives.
Terrific. Kate?
Add to that, on the economic.
What was the question?
Oh my goodness, well let's take it all the way back. So no, I was asking about, you know, there's a political piece, but then there's also a kind of economic piece and what's happening during this period. And we know we've got the black codes, and we have this very powerful discussion by Thavolia about the agency people are taking to kind of try and make their way. And I guess what I was getting at with the question is there are these dual tracks where African Americans are interested in obtaining political power, but also very deeply on a day-to-day basis interested in this question of work and labor and the ability to take care of themselves. And that's a key issue in the Reconstruction period as well. At the same time, whites are in the South are seeking to keep blacks from political power, but also very primarily interested in how do we control this labor force for our own ends.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, and I think sometimes when I think about teaching this material and to undergraduates in particular, and sometimes people forget about the fact that slavery itself was a labor system, right? And so the entire system that was being upended at this point was founded in how planters, people with land, were going to make money off their land growing certain kinds of staple crops. And plantations had particular kinds of forms. They required particular kinds of labor that over the course of the earlier parts of American history, ultimately people who owned a lot of land in the South began to increasingly and over time, almost in a majority, used enslaved workers to work that land. And so the magnitude of the upheaval when you think about emancipation, I mean, as Thavolia said, first of all, just to imagine the liquidation of that amount of capital that people had tied up, that owners had tied up in their enslaved workers who were also used as capital. They were used as collateral for loans. They would be mortgaged. So this was enslaved people, the property in persons was a major engine of the Southern economy that kind of upheld a system of credit and debt that made everything work. And so you have the sort of liquidation of this form of property from the perspective of the slave owners, and then you have people who are becoming free who are saying, okay, you know, we want to live, we want to survive, and we need to figure out a way to do that in the midst of this system that has, you know, decades and decades in the making. And I think one of the things that's important also to think about is sometimes people wonder, why did freed people tend to stay where they were as opposed to just leaving? And when people are familiar increasingly with the history of the Great Migration in the kind of early 20th century, first of all, there is a lot of migration in the post-Civil War South of African Americans moving to different places, trying to find better lives, but also keeping in mind that leaving where you were required resources. There were trains, boats in the South. You could go places if you wanted, which was absolutely not true during slavery. But you had to have, you know, enough money. Or if you wanted to move and become a farmer, let's say you wanted to move to Kansas or Oklahoma, you had to have tools, you had to have a farm animal. And these very kind of everyday forms of personal property were also very hard to come by in the post-emancipation South for freed people. And so the kind of economic system that's primarily rural, that is just in the kind of wake of slavery, is something that it's sometimes hard for us to wrap our minds around that, but it is very kind of important to put ourselves back and try to imagine what that would have been like.
Well, there's so many stories here that we can't really pull the thread, you know, on. I mean, even just talking about what that movement is like. There are many newly freed slaves who are moving, and one of the reasons that they're moving is that they're looking for their family members. So there's a whole story to be told about the effort of newly freed slaves and the effort of so many of them to try to reconnect with children who were sold, with spouses who were sold, with mothers and fathers. And so there is a kind of an effort to do that dynamic movement. But as you talk about, it requires resources, it requires knowing where to go and where you are, right? If you have been raised on this one plantation for your entire life, your sense of the world and geographically is severely limited. And then, of course, the threat of violence. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of violence in the Reconstruction period, which is so important. Violence as a means of ensuring that Reconstruction does not fulfill its promise. And you talked about this already, Kate, with you know, thinking about the pushback against, you know, the violence against federal officials. To be a postmaster was to really take your life in your hands as a black person during this period. And I think it's important to just touch briefly on the role of violence, and then I want to pivot to what's already been alluded to, and that's a little bit about what happens in reconstructing the story in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction period of what slavery really was, the whole lost cause idea, and the monument issue that we've been talking about, you know, in our contemporary debates, that really emanates from what do you do when an event like this happens, when you have a massive, large-scale human rights violation happening in terms of slavery, deeply connected to the economy, deeply connected to a political system, and then it's reversed. How do you account for that in this new nation? And it seems to me this is the project that gets distorted. So maybe, Eric, we could begin with you just talking a little bit about the violence and the role of violence in Reconstruction, and then we can kind of move on to...
Well, yeah, I mean, violence was pervasive in the Reconstruction period, and as Kate pointed out, and others, it played a very important role it was political violence, or what really you should just call it terrorism, to use a current, you know, understandable term. It was an effort to basically overthrow these governments, restore white supremacy in every area of life, not just politics, but economic life, social life, etc. And it posed a giant problem for the federal government and for local officials. In some places, on some occasions, violence was effectively suppressed. President Grant sent the troops into South Carolina in 1871 and crushed the Ku Klux Klan. But when it revived again a few years later in the Deep South, the federal government was not willing to continue the kind of exhaustion Kate mentioned because of the constant sort of counter-revolutionary violence in the South. So yeah, you can't understand what happens in Reconstruction without also talking about the, you know, violent reaction against it, which is a sign or an indication of how radical the changes were, that those changes stimulated such a violent a violent reaction. And of course, extra-legal violence doesn't end with the end of Reconstruction. Lynching, you know, 3,000 or 4,000 people were lynched in the South from around 1880 to the 1950s, et cetera. So, you know, violence remains an important part of the Jim Crow system, which comes into play after Reconstruction is over.
Given this reality, given this extreme violence to the point that you have to have actual statutes, you know, the Ku Klux Klan, actually, you have to actually speak to the violence, you know, as a matter of legislation. What is the investment of Northerners in adopting a story about what the Confederacy was about that gives it some kind of nobility? Right? And we were talking about this a little bit in the corridor, right? That when we talk about the lost cause and we talk about the, you know, later period in which monuments were created and so forth, this is not just about Southerners describing the story of who they were in this war in a noble way. This is about Northerners being absolute participants and endorsers of this narrative about the nobility of the Confederacy. And yet you're describing this ongoing violence, right, that they're having to fight against, and that you know, we could maybe say they ultimately become exhausted with, but they're not willing to do what must be done, right, to deal with that kind of terrorist violence. What's their investment in this narrative, this untrue narrative? Anybody can.
So, you know, I think, first of all, so Kate and I kind of know we kind of disagree about this a little bit. When we say Northern exhaustion, I'm talking about Northern exhaustion with Black people. I'm not talking about Northern exhaustion with Southern whites. They're not exhausted with them. So when Southerners began become even more violent, because slavery is violent and a war in itself, Northerners pushed back a little bit, you know, with their force acts. Grant sends troops to South Carolina, but not too much. And so this is one of the really interesting kind of historical stories where a nation goes to war against people who are committing treason, right? Mm-hmm. And then it wins that war and it doesn't follow up, right? It doesn't say, okay, we won and you people are still acting crazy, so now we need to follow up and convince you that we won. Instead it says, well, there's some things you were right about. You were right that Black people are inferior, right? And so we grant you that. And so then Lee, to get to the other part of your comment, your question, Robert E. Lee becomes not a heroic Confederate soldier, but a heroic American soldier. Reunion becomes not just a political reunion of North and South, but a kind of reunion that speaks to white supremacy, that puts white supremacy on a pedestal. Only this can explain why we're willing to take state and federal monies to rebury the Confederate dead, to help build monuments to the Confederate dead, to make Gettysburg not just a northern cemetery, but a national cemetery. So there are all kinds of decisions that are made in this moment that suggest, at least to me, that the pushback on the part of the North, you know, it's there in the amendments, the 13th, 14th, it's there in the Forest Bill, but it's not sufficiently there to say that this revolution, this revolt on the part of Southern whites has to be crushed, and it has to, we have to go back. We have to go back. Instead it says, well, we'll take out the troops that we have in 1877. So I think it's really important to make that kind of distinction.
I think that's really powerful and important. I mean, I think even before, correct me if I'm wrong, but almost immediately after the war, when there were Southern jurisdictions that said, well, we just can't have Black troops, and the decision to say, okay, we'll accommodate that. I mean, the accommodation begins almost immediately.
Exactly.
Yeah. Kate, did you want to?
No, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I guess One thing, though, I mean, in terms of Northern white people really accepting the lost cause idea that was kind of generated in the South as a defense of the Confederacy, I think some scholarship has shown that veterans of the United States military from the Civil War held on to the idea that this war had been, you know, sort of their version of this was a good war. We fought a bad enemy. We don't want to see a lot of concessions to, you know, their cause was good, our cause was good, we're all brothers now. And so part of the dynamic is and this is, you know, other historians who have looked at like the Grand Army of the Republic chapters, this Veterans Association of US Civil War veterans, is that when they died, when their generation died out too, I mean, and also let's just add that they were one group of people. They weren't necessarily in control of what Northerners were doing, what Congress was doing, but certainly when they passed from the scene by, let's say, you know, kind of the 1890s and early 20th century, that was a really important moment for, among white people, not among black people, but among white people, a kind of the fading out of whites willing to defend what many people believed the Civil War had become, which was in part a war to abolish slavery and set the nation on a new course toward equality. And I mean, and African Americans, as we've talked about, as Savolia has said, you know, also continued the memory, as David Blight has written, you know, continued the memory of the Civil War as being that war for emancipation, for a new nation founded on a new footing that remedied some of the problems of the original nation that was forged in slavery. That never went away. It was just that it was abandoned by white Americans for a very long time.
And you know that it's powerful because, I'm going to come to you, Eric, because of when you look at these, I'm always quite moved by looking at these monuments that were created mostly in the first half of the 20th century to a war that happened in the century before to lift up the Confederacy. The size, the heaviness, the height, there is just in the very physicality an attempt to impose a narrative, right? To counter the narrative of reality that, as you say, never went away and the African Americans are pushing forth. And so there is a feeling, when I see them, there is a feeling of a response to, and a very powerful, an attempt to be overwhelming response to another narrative. Eric, what did you want to say about this?
Well, I was going to say what everyone here knows, that history does matter, actually, how people think about history. The mythology of Reconstruction, which I think Professor Guelzo mentioned in the first panel, that it was a period just of corruption, misgovernment, that giving the right to vote to blacks was a terrible error, was not just a historical interpretation, but it was part of the intellectual legitimation of the Jim Crow system. In other words, it had very clear lessons. It was a mistake to give black men the right to vote. Therefore, we were right to take away that right to vote, and if you give it back again, you'll have all the horrors of Reconstruction again. Reconstruction was imposed on the South by Northerners. They don't understand race relations. The horrors of Reconstruction show you that. Therefore, the white South should resist any outside pressures for change, which began to build up in the 1930s, 1940s, et cetera. And even the Supreme Court, of course, this is the problem with Supreme Court jurisprudence on this matter. It's based on history. It's based on precedent. You had bad decision after bad decision, sometimes based on a misreading of the history, but that's still good law. Very few of those cases that we heard about in the first panel have actually been overturned by the Supreme Court has never been willing to get up and say, we blew it, folks. We actually blew it, and let's start again. You can't start again. There's all that weight of history still there. And so what people think about the history of this period actually has very practical consequences, not just, as an academic matter.
Yeah, and I'd say, for me, that I'll just step out of my attempt to be a very neutral moderator at this moment. But, as a civil rights litigator, when you look at some of the cases that we litigate, particularly in the voter suppression space, in which not we, but federal judges are saying that, whole legislatures of states like Texas and North Carolina convened and passed voter suppression laws for the purpose of discriminating against African American voters. That's two decisions by two federal courts in just the last 5 years. And you compare that to the Supreme Court's decision in the Shelby County case in 2013, in which essentially the Supreme Court is saying is, you are kind of impugning the honor and the nobility of the South, and you're branding them with this terrible history, and and it's unfair to them. It sounds in my litigation spirit very similar to what you're describing, in which the court also gets invested in a narrative about what is happening today, even when that narrative is counter to the facts, counter to what we've been able to prove at trial, counter to what federal judges have found. And so this is dangerous. Yeah. The adoption of false narratives in this space is really, really dangerous to fulfilling the promise of the 14th Amendment, which is full citizenship for African Americans. I'm going to go to questions from the audience. We have some good ones. We have multiple questions on this subject, which I think everyone wonders. Do you think Reconstruction might have gone better had Lincoln still been president, not been assassinated? Kate, I'll take it down there and we'll bring it back.
Well, I think that's a fantasy that a lot of people have, and I was recently thinking about this a lot because I was writing something about the movie Lincoln, Spielberg's Lincoln, and that there really is a fantasy in that movie. If you look closely, it doesn't hit you over the head, but there is a fantasy in that movie that if Lincoln had lived, things would have turned out better. And you have a couple of scenes where Lincoln says to Grant in this movie, don't be too hard on them, meaning the white South. And you have a scene with Thaddeus Stevens where he's kind of maniacal, whereas Lincoln is the moderate force. And so I think overall the movie has this fantasy that part of the tragedy of Lincoln's assassination was that Reconstruction would have gone better, which also sort of implies in this narrative that kind of race relations would have been better, that Lincoln would have solved all of our collective problems with that. And I think that's, obviously not the case. I think and historians also generally don't like counterfactuals, and it's hard to, we can't say what would have happened, but Andrew Johnson was a totally inept president. He was not only a horrible racist, but he was also very bad as a politician, and he couldn't understand what was going on in Congress. As Eric said, he couldn't understand the kind of northern public opinion. Lincoln was obviously a very skilled politician. Lincoln might, as Eric's book on Lincoln sort of shows, Lincoln consistently over the course of his political career kind of moved to what we would consider the left when pushed by African Americans, when pushed by Republicans who were more progressive than he was. So it's possible, it's likely that Lincoln would have been a much more astute politician than Andrew Johnson, and it's quite possible that he would have worked much better with Congress, although on the other hand, he was already at odds with Congress over Reconstruction policy when he was assassinated. But I think to the extent that the weight of the question is about whether the kind of panoply of problems and conflicts and kind of challenges of dealing with the legacies of slavery in this country could have been avoided if Lincoln had lived longer, I think, no, absolutely not. This is a world that we all have to inhabit and cope with, and kind of imagining Lincoln living through his second term, it would not have solved that problem.
Eric?
I agree.
Okay. Question, should the de facto segregation of the North be part of the conversation? Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely, and I'm going to hold my comment. Anyone on the panel want to comment on that?
Of course it should, and one of the problems, and or let us put it this way, one of the virtues of the kind of rethinking of Reconstruction Kate mentioned a while ago is, yes, you have to bring the North into this, not only as policymakers, but in terms, the North at least acquiesced in the race system in the South, and more than that, it actually was complicitous in it. We talked about why didn't, African Americans found themselves sort of at the bottom of the poorest region in the country. The South remained desperately poor all through the 19th and well into the post-Civil War and well into the 20th century. Blacks are at the bottom of that. Why didn't they just pick up and move? The real economic dynamism was in the North, the modern industrial revolution going on. Why didn't black people just pick up and go to work up there? But the fact is, those employers would not hire black people until they would much rather go 5,000 miles away to bring in people from Italy or the Russian Empire or Eastern Europe as the millions came in to work in the factories of Pittsburgh and the stockyards of Chicago, et cetera, than go 500 miles to the South and bring up blacks. How do we know that? Well, it's obvious because 1914 World War I breaks out in Europe. It cuts off immigration. Then the Great Migration begins. Then jobs open up in the North at the bottom of the industrial ladder, but still much better than you can do. And then you get a massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North. But for many, many years, they're kind of trapped. They can't get out of the South, except in fairly small numbers, until jobs open up in the North. But by then, they're moving into, fundamentally segregated communities in Chicago, Pittsburgh, Detroit, et cetera, and so that's all part of this story of why you pick up any newspaper today and you'll discover the vast disparities that still exist in social, statistics, economic statistics between black and white Americans. And it's all rooted, it's not just rooted in slavery, it's rooted in the continuation of racial inequality long after slavery was gone.
And if you really want to learn more about this, then I want to commend to you a book that was published last year. It was longlisted for the National Book Award, and it's Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law.
Right.
And it is about the role of the federal government in segregating the American North in the 20th century. Very, very important to marry to this period. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, did you want to say? Okay. So Eric Foner said that Reconstruction worked in some ways. In what ways did it work in the former Confederacy?
Well,
Eric,
no, you go ahead.
No, you said it, so you.
We always talk about Reconstruction as a failure, which is, I think, not actually the best way to look at it.
Actually, we don't. Who talks about it that way?
Well, like on exam questions, midterm exams, why did Reconstruction fail?
The reason I'm interrupting you is because there is a narrative about Reconstruction that I can tell you is in the African American community that is actually very proud. That focuses on all of the African American elected officials, how many African American men were registered to vote in that period. We think that actually many Americans don't know that African Americans were, elected as secretaries of state, lieutenant governors in southern states.
To that.
Because there's no monuments.
Like there are to the Confederate generals.
So
no, that is, it didn't last.
Yes.
In other words, that is a moment to be very proud of.
Okay.
It failed to become a permanent feature of the society. But many accomplished, apart from that, the black church as it exists today really comes out of Reconstruction. It had existed beforehand, but as a massive institution in the black community. Black families, as you said, were reconstituted who had been separated under slavery. Black schooling, black public schools, higher education comes out of Reconstruction. And these are the springboards for the future struggle. So it's not like everything was wiped away, despite the reaction that came later. And so, and even the very fact that these governments existed, that they started rebuilding the South, they set up the first public school systems in the South, they passed the first civil rights. We heard about the need for state-level civil rights, as Martha said before. That comes out of Reconstruction, the first state civil rights legislation in U.S. history. So, there are many accomplishments. There are many failures, like in any historical situation.
Let me use this question because we haven't used the words Freedmen's Bureau, and we've been supposed to be talking about Reconstruction, so we have to. And so I wonder if Thavolia, you or Kate could talk about what you think is maybe the most, one or two of the most positive things to come out of the Reconstruction period, some of which, still last to this day.
Well, the Freedmen's Bureau, certainly important on the ground. Important for helping people to find their families, important for helping to negotiate contracts, even though most of the sub-assistant commissioners were more inclined to say to people, look, don't expect to get rich, don't expect to eat more food, your rations will probably be the same, you're free now, and one day all that stuff will come. But still, it's important. But also, the point I also want to make here about the Bureau is that the history of the Bureau has been given to us as a kind of a burden on the American taxpayer. So this Federal Bureau is set up and has a commissioner, Oliver Howard, for whom Howard University is named. It has the state sub-commissioners and then the sub-assistant commissioners. And they're all on the ground working to help Black people make the transition from slavery to freedom. And so one thing I want to say about that is that the money for the Freedmen's Bureau in part comes from the labor of Black people during the Civil War. That what we don't talk about is that when people became free and the government sent them to work on plantations, they were paid a wage and they were taxed. And the taxes went into something called the Freedmen's Fund. The Freedmen's Fund funded the Bureau in part, and it funded several Black colleges. So that's a part of the story about Reconstruction that we don't tell, that is, if told in that way, would be seen as an accomplishment on the part of Black people, that we actually, or they actually played a role in funding this organization that helped so many. And there are lots of bad stories one could tell about the Bureau as well.
What do you think was one of the accomplishments of Reconstruction that you think was long-lasting?
Well, I think I'll say what seems kind of obvious in this context, which is the 3 constitutional amendments, right? I mean, so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were complicated, which were not immediately realized, but which really had the potential to transform the structure of American government and the ways that we understand individual rights and equality. And you know, the earlier panel, you know, did a great job of sort of talking about that, but I think, and you said this in your introduction, I mean, I want to really, it's really important, and I hope maybe the 2 panels together can do this, is to contextualize the 14th Amendment in the history of Reconstruction, so that, you know, it's often, we can think about it, especially if we're thinking about constitutional law or in the abstract, as just another tool or another, you know, amendment, another thing that you can sort of work through legally, but that this is a product of this era, along with the 13th and the 15th Amendments. And when you think about how they really transformed federalism, or let's say they had the potential to really transform federalism. And I like to make sure to underscore the enforcement clauses of each of those amendments. That, you know, the 5th section of the 14th Amendment is Congress has the power to enforce this amendment, and the 13th Amendment has a similar one, and so does the 15th. And that is part of what signals the transformation, that before the Civil War, even if Congress, which it never did, had wanted to end slavery in the states where it already existed, or enforce the rights of African Americans or anybody else in the states, it would not have had, most people thought, the constitutional power to intervene in the states in that way. And so these amendments really transformed the role of the federal government, and they really made it possible to have an idea of individual rights that could be enforced or kind of backstopped by the federal government if the person in the local area was not having their rights respected. So it really kind of had the potential to redefine you know, just about everything that kind of goes on in this country.
So Kate has ended precisely where I wanted to end, as though planned, because I do think this is important. We knew that this panel could not take in everything. There are so many more things to talk about. We haven't talked about you know, the failure of women's suffrage, and including Black women, you know, on the very terms of the 14th Amendment. We haven't talked about the effort of emancipated Blacks to try and get a pension, you know, to just try and get money so that they could bury their dead, and to try and get money so that they could give old age pensions to slaves who were physically broken in many ways and who you know, could not work anymore. There are many stories to tell during this period, and so I really encourage people to delve deeply into what happened during this important period in American democracy. But Kate ended where I wanted to end, which is to say, as a civil rights litigator, that our conception of what the federal government has the power and indeed the obligation to do in the face of challenges to the terms of equal protection of laws and due process of laws comes out of those enforcement clauses of the 14th Amendment. And this innovation is how I think of it. This powerful innovation in the 14th Amendment is one of the most important things to come out of the Reconstruction period. And that is to imagine a role in which the federal government has an obligation to protect the citizens against the state. And we should really be clear about that, because I think sometimes people pretend that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are not what they are. It's powerful for an amendment to the Constitution to say no state shall, or that the state cannot, right? It is directed at the states, and provides for the federal government to have the enforcement power when the state does not comply. And as you look and you read about different challenges, civil rights challenges that you're seeing play out in our contemporary landscape, I invite you all to remember that by the explicit terms of these amendments, it was expected that the federal government would play a role in protecting the rights of citizens against infringements by the state. And this innovation is the center of our second founding, which happens after the Civil War and happens during this construction period with the passage of the Civil War amendments. And I just could not be more thrilled to have had this conversation with this terrific panel, and please thank them with me for this discussion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
That was great.
All right, very good.
Let me